The afternoon was hot and humid, typical of central Mexico, where the heat seems to cling to the skin and soul. The city of Guadalajara, with its narrow streets and the unmistakable smell of street food, was quieter than usual. The neighbors knew there was a wake in progress, but nothing more than that. They didn't know that this funeral would have repercussions that could shake the foundations of the entire city and of Mexico. At the center of the ceremony was the coffin of José El Gato Salazar, a man whose life had been marked by violence and mystery. Known in the region for his ties to organized crime, few were certain of his true identity, but everyone knew his name was intertwined with the ranks of CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which in recent years had become one of the biggest threats to the country's security. Those present at the wake were in a palpable state of tension, many with their eyes fixed on the coffin, others exchanging furtive glances. They knew that deep down, it wasn't just the death of José El Gato that brought them together, but fear. The fear of who might be behind his death, or rather, of who would react to it. Ricardo, the Jackal. Perez, a man with a hardened gaze, was among the first to arrive. Wearing a dark coat and with a blank expression, he approached the coffin, his empty stare reflecting the coldness of his soul. Ricardo knew that José wasn't just any name. He was, in fact, the brother of the infamous Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. José, better known as El Mencho, was the supreme leader of the CJNG, a figure whose name was feared not only in Mexico, but in much of the world. José's death could be the trigger, something no one wanted. But like a puzzle waiting to be solved, José's funeral seemed to be just the first step in a larger story. A story involving betrayals, revenge, and of course, the power of one of the most powerful cartels in the world. Amidst the murmur of hushed conversations, the chapel door slammed open. Alfonso, a government agent who had infiltrated the building, entered with a furtive glance. His disguise was perfect, but his heart was racing. He knew the CJNG would never let a golden opportunity pass. But what he didn't know was that the reaction of El Mencho, the man behind it all, would be far more devastating and unpredictable than anything he had ever faced. Suddenly, the door opened again, and this time it was a group of hooded men, their faces hidden and armed to the teeth, who entered the chapel. They were silent, but fear was visible on the faces of the few present. The group didn't say a word, but their intentions were as clear as day. The CJNG was there, and the visit wasn't to offer condolences. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like time had stood still. And amidst that atmosphere heavy with menace, no one could imagine what was about to happen. The city of Guadalajara was a place of contrasts. On one side, the streets vibrated with the sound of mariachis and street vendors, as if life went on, oblivious to the violence that permeated the shadows. But in the narrow alleys and more peripheral areas, fear was palpable. There, in an isolated neighborhood of the city, was where the greatest enemies of José El Gato and El Mencho hid. The CJNG controlled not only the drug trade, but also the streets, the minds, and the hearts of the people. The residents of the outskirts saw El Mencho almost as a mythological figure, someone whose actions and decisions changed the fate of hundreds of families. The power he wielded went beyond criminality. He was the invisible ruler, the monster under the bed that no one dared to look directly at. His influence over local politics and the police made him an almost untouchable entity, but he was no ordinary leader. On the morning of the wake, the eyes of Ricardo the Jackal Perez, their gaze was fixed on José's coffin, but their thoughts were far away. He was no ordinary man, but a man whose ties to the cartel ran deep and whose knowledge of the world's dark ways made him indispensable to El Mencho. Ricardo's story was not one of simple ambition. He had lost everything in the distant past, and by allying himself with the cartel, he found a purpose and a new power. Ricardo was no ordinary assassin. He was cunning and calculating. He knew that El Mencho's world was full of betrayals, where loyalty was tested to the limit. Those who fell from grace were forgotten, eliminated cruelly and efficiently. He observed the people at the wake, aware that among those present were friends and enemies in disguise. But what worried him at that moment was not the wake itself, but what would come next. If José El Gato had truly been killed by a rival within the cartel, it would open a power vacuum for someone to exploit, and he knew very well that he wouldn't be the only one trying to take advantage of that opportunity. Next to Ricardo was Alfonso, the undercover agent. His face was hidden by a black cloak, and his eyes darted rapidly from one corner of the room to the other. Alfonso had no choice but to blend in with the others, but his objective was not the same. He was part of a dangerous game, a spy whose loyalties were divided. When he accepted the mission to infiltrate the CJNG, he knew the consequences would be fatal if he were discovered. However, he never imagined that his mission would become so personal. Alfonso had lost people to the cartel, people close to him, like his sister, who had been executed after a mistake made by her ex-boyfriend, a member of the CJNG. He knew the cartel had no mercy, and that his presence there at the wake meant more than just a simple investigation. He needed to uncover the truth behind José El Gato's death, but at the same time, he couldn't let his personal vendetta cloud his judgment. At the center of that wake, both men, Ricardo and Alfonso, were playing a high-stakes game. One was trying to maintain his power within the CJNG, while the other was trying to destroy the cartel from the inside out. But they shared something in common: fear. The fear of what would happen when the truth about José El Gato and his death was finally revealed. What no one knew at that moment was that the true test of loyalty and survival was about to happen. When the hooded members of the CJNG stormed the wake, it wasn't just to commit an act of violence. It was a message. And in the end, it would be a message that would change everything, Ricardo and Alfonso, and perhaps for everyone involved. The wake for José El Gato Salazar had turned into a scene of chaos and tension, but no one dared to make a rash move. The CJNG men who stormed the chapel were in formation, observing the surroundings with cold, calculating gazes. Each of them seemed to represent a part of the cartel's brutal force, which had spread throughout the city. The murmurs subsided, and even the most audacious, who had previously spoken in hushed voices, were now silent, fearing what was to come. Ricardo El Chacal Perez stood in the back, attentive to every movement. He observed the hooded figures with a careful gaze, but without showing fear. His mind was sharp, considering all possibilities. He knew that the CJNG was efficient at eliminating any threat, and that this funeral was not a simple event to pay homage to a lost member. It was a demonstration of power. One of the hooded figures approached José's coffin, looking silently at those present. It seemed as if I was waiting for something. The tension in the air was so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Ricardo felt the weight of the moment. It was a message, but a message for whom? For him? For everyone there? He knew there was something more behind that invasion, something that wasn't immediately clear. At this very moment, Alfonso, the undercover agent, stepped forward discreetly, trying to observe everything without drawing attention. His mission was far more risky than he had imagined. He had been sent to uncover the truth behind José's death, but what he was beginning to realize was far more complex. Alfonso knew something wasn't right. The CJNG was acting differently this time. They were bolder, more aggressive. Something big was about to happen. The silent message that the hooded figures were trying to convey seemed clear. No one, not even the cartel's enemies, could dare to challenge the authority of El Mencho. It was a declaration of power and control, and everyone at the wake was a pawn in the game. But there was something deeper at stake. Alfonso knew that José El Gato Salazar was no mere pawn, and his death seemed to have been just the catalyst for a larger movement within the cartel. While CJNG's henchmen looked around, one of them approached Ricardo, who didn't move. The man leaned in slightly, his cold eyes reflecting an implicit threat. Ricardo felt the pressure, but maintained his composure. He wasn't there to be intimidated. "Did you know this was going to happen?" the man asked in a low voice, but one filled with malice. Ricardo didn't answer immediately. He knew that words could be both a blessing and a curse, but he also knew that, deep down, he was being watched, analyzed. Any sign of weakness could be fatal. Alfonso, watching the conversation, he felt a tightness in his chest. His training had taught him to remain silent, to observe, to wait. But at that moment, he couldn't stop thinking about the implications. José wasn't El Mencho's only brother, but he was undoubtedly the closest thing to a fragile link the cartel leader had with the city. If the CJNG was behaving this way, José's death had far greater implications than the simple desperation of revenge. The silence was broken by a sharp scream. A woman, likely a relative of José, fainted upon seeing the CJNG men approaching the coffin. The sound of her fall startled everyone present, and for a brief moment everyone stared at the coffin. It was at that instant that the real conflict unfolded. Ricardo felt a wave of distrust sweep through his mind. He knew he could no longer wait for others to act. It was time to act, but how? He couldn't reveal his position as an ally of El Mencho at any moment. The cartel wouldn't forgive a slip-up. At the same time, he knew that Alfonso, the infiltrator, wouldn't stand idly by for long. The situation was about to spiral out of control, and the worst part was that no one there knew how deep the corruption was within the cartel itself. Every member of the group, every furtive glance, every disguised movement could hide a betrayal. At that moment, a distant sound like a car engine grew louder, breaking the prevailing silence. Everyone looked outside, but nothing was revealed. What no one knew, however, was that more than a simple break-in was about to happen. Something else was in motion, something that no one at the funeral could have anticipated. The tension at the wake increased with each passing second. Ricardo El Chacal Perez cautiously observed the CJNG henchmen, trying to read their intentions. His eyes were fixed on Alfonso, the undercover agent, who, like a broken mirror, seemed to shatter with each new piece of information that emerged. He didn't know if he could trust Alfonso, but something inside him told him that the agent wasn't the only one with secrets at that funeral. Meanwhile, the CJNG members showed no signs of being in a hurry. They were there to send a message, and everyone present, whether allies or enemies, was being forced to absorb the weight of that message. José El Gato Salazar had been more than just a victim. His death was a piece on a much larger chessboard, and the calculating looks on everyone's faces indicated that the game was only just beginning. Ricardo knew he was being tested. If he made the wrong move, the consequences would be fatal. And, deep down, he feared what El Mencho would do if he knew Ricardo was there, at that moment facing his fallen brother. For Ricardo, loyalty was a double-edged sword. It could give him power, but it could also be his downfall. He needed to understand what the cartel's next move would be, and who was willing to betray him, including within his own circle. Alfonso, on the other hand, felt an even greater weight. He was not only infiltrated in the CJNG, but his personal involvement with the tragedy that haunted his family put him in a difficult position. He couldn't allow the cartel to continue its escalation of violence, but he also knew that his mission to destroy the CJNG could end his life. And somewhere deep down, he wondered, who was he trying to save, Mexico or himself? He watched Ricardo's every move. The man seemed unperturbed, but there was something in his gaze that betrayed an inner tension. Alfonso realized that however much he tried to maintain his position, he too was immersed in a sea of betrayals, not only on the cartel's side, but within the police force itself, which was infiltrated by corrupt figures. He wondered how far he could go without being discovered. Who could he truly trust? Meanwhile, outside the chapel, government forces were preparing for a large-scale operation. Captain Morales, the head of the local police team, already had his own plans for the future of the CJNG. Although he knew nothing about Alfonso's presence, he sensed that something was about to happen. The Mexican government could no longer ignore the cartel's growing power, and the death of José El Gato could be the trigger for open warfare between rival factions within the government itself. But what Morales didn't know, and what no one there imagined, was that the true power of the CJNG lay in the shadows, beyond the reach of any political operation or maneuver. El Mencho. The cartel leader knew a war was about to break out, but he wasn't worried. He had something far more dangerous in mind, something that didn't just involve controlling the city or eliminating his enemies. He wanted something that surpassed the ambition of any human being. He wanted a network of power so vast that no government, no army, not even the most sophisticated police operation could stop him. As the net closed in, Ricardo and Alfonso, they were merely pieces in a much larger game. What they didn't know was that they were both being manipulated, moved like pawns by invisible hands. Each believed they were in control of their own narrative, but the truth was that they were both in the middle of a web of lies, betrayals, and power games. In a far corner of the chapel, a woman watched everything with a penetrating gaze. She was Veronica, sister of José El Gato Salazar, and the last person anyone would imagine as an active part of this game. She knew more than she was letting on. For years, she had been a neglected figure, seen as a mere spectator in the dangerous world of crime. But now, with José's death, she knew her time had come. Veronica had a debt to settle, a debt for her brother's death and for the cartel itself. She had lost a lot, but she also knew she could gain even more. Her loyalty, like that of everyone else present, was about to be tested. And like all subplots in life, this story also had its own ending, an ending that no one, not even she, could have foreseen. The atmosphere in the chapel was tense, as if everyone present was breathing at the same time, waiting for the right moment to act. The CJNG invasion seemed to have paused for a moment, but a sense of impending doom hung in the air. Ricardo El Chacal and Alfonso, each with their own objectives, felt the weight of the situation, but the game was about to change unexpectedly. It was then that, suddenly, the chapel door burst open with a deafening bang. The sound of tires screeching in the street mingled with the noise of metal being ripped. There was no time for anything else. What seemed like a simple siege had turned into a real battle. Veronica, José El Gato's sister, was the first to act. Somehow she had known that this was the moment to reveal her true power. With an unexpected gesture, she pulled out a pistol that was hidden under her dress. But what truly stunned everyone was not the fact that she was armed, it was who was with her. The door opened once more, but now, instead of hooded men from the CJNG, a new group entered. They were government men, but not the ones Ricardo or Alfonso had imagined. They were dressed discreetly, but the way they moved, with confidence, precision, and total control of the situation, revealed that they were in a far superior position to any of the others there. Captain Morales, the leader of the operation, appeared in the doorway. His gaze was cold, and his presence exuded authority. He gestured with his hand, signaling for his men to take position. The confusion, which until then had been merely an exchange of glances and silent threats, instantly transformed into an open confrontation. What nobody knew, but Veronica had anticipated, was that Morales was not there to arrest the CJNG members. He had a much darker mission in mind. He was there to clear the path for himself. El Mencho, who had infiltrated the highest echelons of government, manipulating the laws and security forces of Mexico. Ricardo, who until then believed he was in control of the situation, suddenly found himself in an existential dilemma. He was no longer just a pawn of the cartel. He was part of a much larger game than anyone could have imagined. The CJNG didn't just have street power, it now had state power. The revelation was devastating. As the first exchanges of gunfire echoed through the chapel, Ricardo looked at Alfonso, whose eyes were fixed on Morales, with an expression of disbelief. Alfonso didn't know what to do. He had infiltrated the CJNG, hoping to bring it down from the inside out, but now it was clear that he had been just another pawn in the plan of El Mencho. He had been manipulated not only by the cartel, but also by the invisible hands of Morales and his allies in the government. The true revelation came with Veronica's cry, which, in an even more shocking twist, revealed her own connection to the government. She wasn't there as a simple, grieving sister. She was there as a informant de Morales, long infiltrated within the ranks of the CJNG. What seemed to be a moment of vulnerability, with her grief over the loss of her brother, actually concealed an even deeper betrayal. Veronica wasn't seeking revenge for José's death. She was carrying out a mission given by Mexican authorities to dismantle the cartel from within. Chaos intensified as gunshots echoed, and the chapel, which had previously seemed to be the setting for a simple wake, was now the stage for a silent war between government factions, the CJNG, and the very allies within the chapel. Ricardo, having just discovered he had been manipulated by all sides, found himself cornered. He didn't know who to trust more, the cartel or the authorities. But what he did know was that he would no longer have control over his destiny. The real fight was only beginning. The revelations that emerged at that moment irreversibly rewrote the future of everyone in the room. Who would be able to survive the imminent fall of the CJNG empire? And above all, who would have the power to decide the fate of all those involved? The sound of gunfire continued to echo through the chapel, reverberating off the walls and reaching the streets. The scene, which had previously resembled a funeral, was now transforming into a battlefield. Ricardo El Chacal Perez, the man who considered himself the master of his own loyalty, now found himself lost in a sea of betrayals and revelations. The control he believed he had over the CJNG crumbled before his eyes, and the weight of the truth, still raw and relentless, began to weigh on his shoulders. Veronica, pistol still in hand, looked at the chaos around her, showing not a single tremor of doubt. She had played her part in the game, revealing the link between the government and the CJNG, and now it remained to be seen how the rest of the scenario would unfold. But despite her cold demeanor, a flame of emotion ignited within her. It wasn't simple revenge for José, but a quest for a power she had always known she could attain, even in the shadows of the cartel. She looked at Ricardo, her eyes filled with calculated calm. "You didn't know anything, did you?" she said, her voice low and sharp, like a razor blade. "Now we will all pay the price for our ignorance." Ricardo didn't answer. He knew nothing would make sense anymore. Veronica's words echoed in his mind, but the pain of being manipulated, of being a puppet in a game bigger than himself, paralyzed him. But there was something more, something he felt, something that pushed him toward a final decision. He knew he could no longer be a pawn. It was time to choose a side, any side, even if it was the last one. While the CJNG henchmen and government agents clashed, Alfonso tried to process everything he had discovered. He was in a deep dilemma. All along he had believed his role in the CJNG was to sabotage the organization, to dismantle it from within. But now, seeing the true depth of the corruption, he wondered if there was still any right course of action to follow. He no longer had control over anything. The pieces he had tried to move throughout his infiltration had been replaced by a web of lies that went far beyond the cartel. He could no longer trust anyone, not even the government agents who, theoretically, were there to help him. Captain Morales, who until then had remained on the sidelines of the chaos, stepped toward the center of the confrontation. His face, always impassive, now showed a gleam of satisfaction. He had orchestrated this moment, and success was within his grasp. The CJNG was on the verge of collapse, and the Mexican government could finally take complete control of the situation. But as he approached the conflict zone, something shifted in his posture. He had underestimated the cartel's capacity for reaction. Suddenly, the CJNG members, who had previously kept their faces hidden, began to react strategically, grouping together and organizing. It was a coordinated movement, unlike what Morales had expected. He sensed the change, a feeling that the forces he had helped create were now turning against him. The CJNG, however dismantled it was being, would not fall without a fight. The truth is that, throughout all these years, Mencho, he had always been more than just a cartel leader. He was an almost mythical figure, a master of the shadows. And now, with the landscape crumbling around him, he had created a network so deep and complex that even after his brother's death, he continued to influence the game. He knew that the government operation, however well planned, was doomed to failure because its ramifications were rooted in the very structures Morales was trying to use to defeat him. Ricardo, now more aware of the extent of the betrayal surrounding him, looked at Veronica one last time. "Do you really think the government can control this?" he asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Veronica didn't smile. She just shook her head, as if reflecting on something even deeper, even more dangerous. They never knew. The battlefield in the chapel now seemed a metaphor for the chaos that had consumed Mexico. The CJNG men, driven by blind loyalty to Mencho, were fighting with unforeseen ferocity. The government, for its part, was aware that there was no more time. They needed a final blow to control the situation, but what no one could foresee was that, while the two sides prepared for the final clash, a third force, invisible and relentless, was already on the move. The chaos in the chapel intensified. The sound of gunfire continued to echo, mixed with the screams and confusion of a confrontation that seemed endless. But amidst the chaos, something within Ricardo El Chacal Perez began to change. He had always operated in the shadows, calculating his steps, balancing his loyalty to the cartel and his personal ambition. But now, amidst the violence and imminent danger, he felt the pressure of something greater, something that forced him to reevaluate everything he knew. The sight of Veronica, pistol in hand, was a metaphor for what he had always known but never wanted to see. Power and betrayal walk hand in hand. He remembered his own trajectory, how he rose through the ranks of the CJNG, forging alliances, taking down enemies, and never hesitating to make cruel decisions. He had always believed that this was the only way to survive in this world. But that night, the game had changed. The CJNG was being destroyed, and government corruption had seeped into the very roots of his own loyalty. The moment of crisis had finally arrived. Captain Morales advanced with his men, and the confrontation between the factions was about to reach its climax, but it was at that very moment that Ricardo felt an inner transformation. He could no longer be a mere executor, a spectator of the puppets that the world had placed on the chessboard. He needed to act. He saw at a glance Alfonso, the undercover agent, in a shootout with some cartel members. Alfonso was visibly worn down, but at the same time, determined. The agent was caught between two worlds, the government mission and the personal fight against the cartel that had destroyed his life. Their eyes met for a second, and something passed between them. It was a silent recognition. Both had been manipulated in some way. Ricardo by the cartel, Alfonso by the government. But Ricardo couldn't wait any longer. He wouldn't be another pawn in someone else's war. He needed to make a decision. His instincts guided him, and he knew that if he wanted any chance of control, he would need to take the reins of the situation. With a swift movement, he pulled out a pistol that was concealed in his jacket. It wasn't to attack, but to threaten the established order. He approached Veronica, his sister, who still observed the chaos with a disturbing calm. Upon seeing Ricardo, she didn't hesitate. "Are you going to kill us all, Ricardo?" she asked, her voice deep and emotionless. "Or will you finally do the right thing?" Ricardo didn't answer immediately. He was at a crossroads. On one hand, he could remain loyal to the CJNG, try to reorganize the cartel's forces, and continue the life he knew. But on the other, he could realize that this was an illusion. The world was changing, and he needed to adapt or die trying to maintain a crumbling empire. "I'm not here to kill anyone. I'm here to live." "That's right," Ricardo replied, his voice firm for the first time in a long time. He wasn't just saying this to her, but to himself. He knew that by making this choice, he was breaking with his past and with the very identity he had built. He was more than just a cartel man. He was someone capable of change. Veronica watched him for a long moment, her eyes piercing, almost challenging. But instead of reacting violently, she simply gave a small smile, as if she knew that this was the decision he would need to make. "So, make the right choice, Ricardo, or we'll all sink." With renewed strength, Ricardo turned and went to Alfonso, who was surrounded by some of the government men. He knew that the agent, despite his mission, was not an enemy. On the contrary, they were in the same fight, both trying to escape the invisible chains that bound them. "Let's put an end to this now," said Ricardo as he approached, quickly clearing away the enemies surrounding Alfonso. He had never been so decisive. He was no longer acting as a spectator to the chaos. He was at its center, shaping events. Alfonso looked at Ricardo with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. They weren't friends, but at that moment, they were allies. The agent knew his mission wasn't over, but he also knew Ricardo was about to change the course of that night, and perhaps change the very history of CJNG. As they fought side by side, the sound of gunfire faded, but the sense of tension never disappeared. The chaos hadn't ended, but Ricardo was beginning to understand what it truly meant to fight for his survival. He no longer needed to be a puppet in the hands of the cartel or the government. He was more than that. But looking at the faces of the others, he knew his journey was only beginning. There was no turning back. He had made a decision that would change him forever. The battle in the chapel dragged on, but gradually the battlefield was reorganizing. The spilled blood and the bodies scattered across the ground were not only testimonies to the impending chaos, but symbols of an empire in ruins. The CJNG, once an unbeatable force, was being slowly dismantled, and the Mexican government, with its internal factions, was finally making the move it had been planning for years. But as the siege closed in, a new dynamic was forming in the shadows. Ricardo El Chacal Perez, now more determined than ever, knew that the decisive moment was near. He had broken with the past, but the consequences of his choices were about to take shape in a way he didn't yet fully understand. Alongside Alfonso as an undercover agent, he became an unlikely ally of a man who represented everything he had despised. But in reality, both were fighting against the same tide, a system of corruption that dominated both the government and the cartel. Veronica, who had previously seemed to be merely a hidden player, had revealed her true colors as a government informant. She knew that the CJNG, without its leader, was lost. And now, with the death of José El Gato Salazar and the destruction of many of his cells, she was finally beginning to reap the rewards of the betrayal she had sown. But her satisfied smile began to fade as the chaos of the factional war took on unexpected proportions. While the confrontation in the chapel continued, the government men, led by Captain Morales, they began to retreat in a strategic maneuver. Instead of continuing with the immediate pressure, they retreated to regroup their forces, but not before playing one last card. Morales knew that, to ensure the definitive fall of the CJNG, he would need the help of a double agent, someone who had the power to turn the tide. Ricardo, he realized this. He knew the government was playing the same dirty game as the cartel, and he wondered how many people had been sacrificed on both sides for a greater power, an invisible power. Morales, now more certain of his victory, believed he had already secured control. But Ricardo, like a man in the shadows, understood that this victory would not be so simple. Alfonso, alongside Ricardo, also felt the growing tension. He knew the operation was nearing its end, the operation to capture the last leaders of the CJNG, including their allies in politics and the security forces. However, he also knew he couldn't trust Morales, who wasn't as naive as he seemed. The captain, as much as he appeared to be the hero of the story, was playing his own power game, and that meant Alfonso's survival, as well as Ricardo's, hung by a thread. At that moment, as the two prepared for the final battle, something seemed to shift in the air. The tension was so thick it was almost palpable. The clock was ticking towards the decisive moment, and every movement, every breath, felt like it weighed a ton. Ricardo felt as if he had given his all, but there was still a sense of emptiness. He knew that to achieve what he wanted, he could no longer be the man he knew. Veronica, she, in turn, was also in her own final preparations. She knew the game was changing, and that the government, though victorious for now, was not the solution to the chaos that would engulf the country in the coming years. The system, with its corruption and lack of control, could not be the new savior, and she had no illusions that if the war ended, everything would be resolved. She had her own plans, more subtle, more calculated. The end of the CJNG was only one part of a much larger movement. She was ready to take the next step, but what would that step be? While the remaining CJNG henchmen attempted to organize a last line of defense, the ground beneath everyone's feet seemed to tremble. A new cycle of violence was about to begin, and no one could predict how it would unfold. Ricardo sensed that, alongside Alfonso, they were ready to face the cartel's last lines of resistance, but they also knew that the fight wasn't just physical, it was mental. It was a battle for who would control the future. Captain Morales, now in a position of power, he knew that his next move would be crucial. He had the means to end the war, but he also had his own dark objectives. He knew that by ensuring the downfall of the CJNG, he was creating a power vacuum. And, as everyone knows, whoever controls the power vacuum decides its fate. The chapel, now almost unrecognizable after the intense confrontation, was shrouded in dust and the distant sound of sirens. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixed with the metallic scent of blood that covered the floor. The bodies, some of CJNG members, others of infiltrated government agents, formed a distorted landscape of death and destruction. But the greatest battle was about to happen, and it wasn't between rival factions, but between what remained of a ruined empire and the shadows that were now taking shape. Ricardo El Chacal Perez felt the weight of his decision more than ever. He had chosen to abandon his loyalty to the CJNG, but now, in the heat of the moment, he knew the final battle lay before him. Captain Morales, with his implacable countenance, watched the scene with a disturbing calm. But it wasn't just the government he represented. It was the hidden, invisible power that sustained him. Next to Alfonso as an undercover agent, Ricardo now had a new understanding of his role in the world. He knew the game was becoming bigger than he had ever imagined, and that any wrong move could be fatal. But the tension in the air, the uncertainty of who was really in control, made him wonder if there was still any plan he could follow. He had become a piece of a much more complex puzzle, and as he watched Morales, he began to understand that his enemy was not just the cartel, but the corrupt structures that sustained the power. The battle continued, but now, subtly, something unexpected was about to unfold. Veronica She, who had for so long positioned herself in the shadows as a government informant, now seemed to be preparing for her final move. She had been part of the game, manipulating everyone with mastery, but now her expression, which had once been cold, was becoming something more ambiguous. She looked at Ricardo with a glimmer of understanding, as if at last they had reached the point of no return. It was no longer about who would win the war, but who would manage to survive it. Before anyone could react, a deafening sound cut through the silence, a loud bang coming from outside the chapel. The doors flung open, and what entered was no longer Morales soldiers, nor the CJNG members. It was something far more dangerous, armed men with cutting-edge technology, not linked to either side. They advanced with military precision. The government wasn't the only one involved. There was something else, a third actor operating in the shadows. They were ready to make the final move, eliminating everyone involved in that hell. The revelation was brutal. Ricardo looked at Veronica, who, in a silent gesture, revealed that she was not only working for the Mexican government, but also for a global organization, an invisible force that had manipulated the conflict from the beginning. The government, the cartel, even the local authorities, were merely being used as pawns. There was a much larger power network at play. Upon realizing the revelation, Morales lunged forward, attempting to regain some control, but the truth was now clear. He too was a pawn, not the main player. He had been manipulated by even more powerful interests, and his attempt to position himself as the leader of the new Mexico was about to be thwarted. Veronica, with a smile that now seemed genuine, looked at Ricardo. The real battle isn't between the government and the cartel, Ricardo. They're just puppets. The real power is something you can't even see. She turned to Morales, who now looked like a disoriented man. And you thought you were in control, but you never were. Ricardo felt the weight of his words. Everything he believed in, everything he had fought to hold on to, was crumbling. The war was never about the CJNG, it was about controlling the system. He had never been more than a disposable piece, a tool. And now, what was he to do with it? There was no turning back. Alfonso, in a swift and decisive movement, pulled out the gun he had hidden under his jacket and pointed it at Veronica. But before he could act, she stopped him with a simple gesture of her hand. There was no need for more violence. He knew what she meant. The game was turning in all directions. There were no more heroes or villains. Everyone was in the same sinking boat. Morales, feeling the pressure of the new reality, he shouted orders to his men. But deep down, he knew he was lost. The fight was no longer just for territory or power. It was a fight for survival, and the empire he had helped build was about to crumble. Ricardo looked around the room. Tensions had reached their peak. He now knew what he needed to do. But before he could act, one last surprise arose, or El Mencho himself, or at least someone posing as him, appeared in the shadows, accompanied by a select group of mercenaries. The confrontation that followed would be decisive. What remained of the CJNG, the government, and the invisible force behind it all were about to collide once and for all. The battle finally subsided, but the air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder, the weight of death and betrayal. The chapel, once a place of reflection and mourning, was now a battlefield, a symbol of all that was at stake. Ricardo El Chacal Perez, alongside Alfonso and Veronica, he observed the desolate scene, a reflection of the choices they had made. El Mencho, or what remained of him, was found in one of the chapel's secret rooms, alive but broken, almost unrecognizable. The leader of the CJNG, who had operated in the shadows for so long, now stood before his own demons. His army was defeated, and the empire he had built was crumbling. But despite this, El Mencho's gaze still held a flame of defiance. He knew his fight was not over. However, the fate that awaited him was that of a defeated man who, in the end, had nothing left to lose. The government, represented by Captain Morales, he had lost control of the situation. The power he believed he possessed was merely an illusion. The true battle was always lurking in the shadows, and the global organization that manipulated every player on the playing field now had its own fate sealed. They, who had orchestrated the war, now found themselves without options. There was no longer any way to hide their intentions. Their actions were exposed, and the very structure of power was about to crumble. But, as with every empire that falls, the consequences would not be immediate. They would echo for years, perhaps decades. Ricardo looked at Veronica. She approached El Mencho. She seemed cold, calculating as always. She wasn't there to celebrate victory, but to take the reins of what remained. The power struggle was far from over, and what was happening at that moment was merely a transition. She knew that by eliminating the CJNG leadership and destroying the government that supported it, she was creating a new vacuum, a vacuum she was ready to fill. Ricardo's final decision was still open. He could have continued with the life he knew, reconstituted the CJNG, and tried to turn the situation to his advantage. But he had already realized that this path was a dead end. What did the future hold for him? Nobody knew for sure, but he also knew that the power was now in his hands, not in the cartel, nor in the government. It was a new era of uncertainty, and he was determined to be the agent of that change. Alfonso, observing Ricardo's transformation, questioned his own destiny. His role as an infiltrator in the cartel was over, but he knew he couldn't return to the life he once knew. The system that had shaped him no longer existed. He too faced a choice: join the new players, those who now controlled the shadows, or leave to build something of his own. There was no turning back for him, just as there wasn't for anyone else. With the sound of sirens drawing closer, signaling the end of the battle, the now silent chapel seemed like a tomb of shattered ambitions and hopes. The story of a collapsing empire, a corrupt government, and a ruined cartel was drawing to a close. But the future, that unknown and dangerous territory, was only just beginning. Months had passed since that fateful day in the chapel. Mexico had changed, its streets now quieter, but fear still hung in the air. Ricardo, the man who had abandoned his loyalty to the cartel, was now at the head of a new power network, operating in the shadows, stronger and more cunning than before. Veronica, she, in turn, disappeared from the radar, but no one doubted that she was plotting something even bigger. Alfonso, with his identity shattered, he set out in search of a new purpose, knowing that the real war was only beginning. The Empire of Shadows was rising again. The story of Ricardo, Veronica, and Alfonso shows us that, in the world of shadows, there are no clear winners, only those who manage to survive the chaos and reinvent themselves. What would you do if you were in their place? How far would you go to maintain or overthrow an empire? Share your thoughts and discover if the line between hero and villain is really as thin as it seems. Keep following, because in the game for power, the story never ends. Who will be the next to rise up? Only time will tell.